Julian Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, staring down at the sprawling city as if he owned every concrete block of it. As the CEO of Vance Global, he practically did, but right now his empire was under threat. Richard Caldwell, the senior board member, was orchestrating a silent coup, using a morality clause from an old family trust to force Julian out if he did not present a stable, married image by the upcoming shareholder summit. Julian crushed the crystal glass in his hand, the expensive whiskey spilling onto the Persian rug. He needed a wife immediately, someone completely under his control who would sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, take the money, and disappear when the storm passed. Elias Grant, his right-hand man and oldest friend, had promised to send a discreet professional to his private suite for an interview. Julian checked his luxury watch. The woman was already 5 minutes late, an offense he rarely forgave. Meanwhile, Clara Thorne was hyperventilating in the hallway of the 65th floor. It was her third day as a temporary secretary in the lower executive tiers, a job she had fought bitterly to get. She was not there to file papers or fetch coffee. She was there to find the encrypted files that proved Richard Caldwell and the Vance board had deliberately bankrupted her father's engineering firm 3 years ago. Clutching a stack of misdirected mail to her chest, she realized she had taken a wrong turn in the labyrinth of mahogany corridors. Hearing footsteps approaching and terrified of being caught out of bounds by security, she ducked into the nearest door, praying it was a supply closet. It was not a supply closet. It was the private executive restroom, a space larger and more luxurious than Clara's entire apartment, lined with black marble and gold fixtures. Before she could turn around and escape, the heavy oak door clicked shut, locking automatically. A deep, cold voice echoed through the pristine space. "You are late," the voice said. Clara froze. Stepping out from the washroom alcove, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate tailored suit, was Julian Vance himself. He was taller than he looked on the magazine covers, with piercing grey eyes that seemed to strip away every defense she had. He did not look surprised to see her. Instead, his gaze swept over her simple pencil skirt, inexpensive blouse, and the chaotic bun holding up her dark hair. "I suppose Elias told you to dress down to avoid suspicion," Julian continued, his tone dripping with arrogant authority. "But you look a bit too convincing as a terrified intern." "I am not," Clara started, but her voice caught in her throat. She gripped the files tighter against her chest, her mind racing. If she admitted she was a lowly secretary trespassing on his floor, she would be fired instantly, and her chance to clear her father's name would be gone forever. "Save the script," Julian interrupted, taking a slow, predatory step toward her. "I do not care about your backstory, I care about results. The contract is simple. We announce our engagement tonight at the Caldwell Charity Gala. We marry on paper by Friday. You will live in my penthouse, smile for the cameras and pretend to be entirely devoted to me. In exchange, you receive $2 million when we quietly divorce in 6 months. Do we have a deal?" Clara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. $2 million. But more importantly, living in his penthouse meant unrestricted access to his home network, his personal files, the exact evidence she needed to take down the men who destroyed her family. She lifted her chin, refusing to shrink under his heavy, intimidating gaze. She forced herself to meet his eyes, letting a spark of defiance show. "If I am going to pretend to tolerate you for 6 months," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady, "the price is $3 million. And I do not fetch your coffee." Julian stopped, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his rigid features. He was used to people bowing to his every whim, intimidated by his wealth and reputation. This woman, standing in his restroom clutching mail like a shield, was challenging him. The corner of his mouth twitched into a smirk. $3 million, he agreed, stepping close enough that she could smell the expensive bergamot and cedar cologne he wore. "And you can drink all the coffee you want. What is your name?" "Clara," she said, omitting her last name for now to protect her identity. "Well, Clara," Julian murmured, offering his hand, "welcome to the Vance family." The ceremony 3 days later was as cold and efficient as a corporate merger. Clara stood in the private judge's chambers, wearing a designer dress that cost more than her college tuition, feeling completely detached from the man beside her. Julian slid a massive diamond ring onto her finger, his touch firm and impersonal. He did not kiss her. He simply nodded to the judge and escorted her out to the waiting limousine. As they sat in the plush leather seats, the silence between them was deafening. Clara looked out the tinted window, the heavy diamond feeling like a shackle on her hand. She was now married to the enemy, entirely submerged in a world of cutthroat billionaires. "Do not look so tragic," Julian said, pouring himself a drink from the car's minibar. "It is a business transaction. I am aware," Clara replied coldly, turning to face him. "But you could at least pretend to have a soul while the driver is watching." Julian paused, his glass halfway to his lips. He studied her, the fierce independence in her eyes, clashing with the elegant, refined image he had bought. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from him. "I paid for a wife, Clara," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "Not a critic." "And I agreed to be a wife," she shot back, not backing down an inch. "Not a servant." The tension in the car crackled, thick and electric. Julian stared at her, an unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. He had expected a docile actress, someone he could ignore. Instead, he had married a firestorm, and for the first time in years, he had no idea how to control the situation. The first few weeks in the penthouse were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Julian had provided Clara with a massive walk-in closet filled with haute couture, but she refused to touch any of it, wearing her own simple clothes whenever they were not in public. This infuriated him, not because she looked bad, but because he could not buy her compliance. During a high-profile charity dinner, a foreign investor tried to corner Clara near the champagne tower, making inappropriate remarks. Julian stepped in immediately, his presence dark and lethal, seamlessly pulling her away with a protective grip on her waist that lingered far longer than the cameras required. Later that night, they stood on the penthouse balcony. Clara looked at the glittering skyline, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. She told him that all his wealth meant nothing if his empire was built on destroying innocent people. Julian clenched his jaw, staring at her, genuinely disturbed by the accusation. He told her she knew nothing about his life or the sacrifices required to maintain it. He did not know she was talking about her own father. The forced proximity began to chip away at their defenses. One rainy evening, Julian came home late, looking pale and exhausted, battling a severe fever he stubbornly refused to acknowledge. Clara found him asleep at his heavy mahogany desk, his breathing ragged. Instead of leaving him, she gently placed a warm blanket over his shoulders and spent the next few hours working quietly beside him, organizing his scattered documents and ensuring he had water and medicine when he woke up. The next morning, Clara woke up in her own bed to find a simple cup of coffee on her nightstand, brewed exactly the way she liked it, with a dash of cinnamon. There was no note, no expensive jewelry to buy her affection, just a silent, tender acknowledgement. For a moment, the cold billionaire felt dangerously human, but the fragile truce shattered 3 nights later. Clara finally managed to bypass the secondary security on his home office server. She was downloading the encrypted files regarding the Caldwell acquisitions when the heavy door swung open. Julian stood in the doorway, his expression turning from mild exhaustion to absolute freezing rage as he saw the progress bar on the screen. He demanded to know what she was doing. Cornered, Clara did not cower. She stood up, tears of deep-rooted anger in her eyes, and revealed her true identity. She was Clara Thorne, daughter of the brilliant engineer whose life and legacy were dismantled and discarded by Vance Global 3 years ago. She accused Julian of being a ruthless monster who crushed her family just to boost a quarterly profit margin. Julian looked as if the ground had been pulled from beneath him. He stepped past her, his eyes scanning the confidential files on the monitor, seeing the authorization signatures. It was not his doing. Richard Caldwell had orchestrated the hostile takeover using a ghost subsidiary, deliberately hiding the financial destruction from Julian to line his own pockets. But the damage between Julian and Clara was already done. She had married him to infiltrate his life and destroy him. Julian felt a strange, sharp ache in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate espionage. He told her in a low, dangerous whisper that she was a fool for thinking he would stoop to Caldwell's level, but he did not throw her out. The days that followed were suffocatingly silent. Julian treated her like a ghost, his emotional walls fully rebuilt and fortified. He spoke to her only when necessary, his tone icy and measured. Yet, his small gestures betrayed his pride. When aggressive paparazzi swarmed the lobby after a leaked rumor about their hasty marriage, Julian abruptly cancelled a critical, multi-million-dollar merger meeting just to escort her safely through the underground garage. He shielded her from the flashing cameras with his own body, making sure no one could touch her, all without saying a single word to her. He was punishing her with silence, but protecting her with his actions. Their internal war was abruptly interrupted when Elias Grant burst into the penthouse one evening, looking completely shaken, completely discarding his usual professional composure. Richard Caldwell had discovered Clara's real identity and her previous employment as a temporary secretary at Vance Global. Caldwell was calling an emergency board meeting for the very next morning. He planned to expose their marriage as a fraudulent scheme designed to manipulate the company shares, effectively voiding Julian's position and handing the entire empire over to Caldwell on a silver platter. Julian looked at Clara, the bitter betrayal still lingering in his eyes, but the crushing threat of a common enemy forcing them back into the same corner. The atmosphere in the Vance Global boardroom the next morning was suffocating. Richard Caldwell sat at the head of the massive glass table, a smug, victorious smile playing on his lips as the senior shareholders murmured among themselves. He stood up, ready to deliver the final blow, declaring that Julian Vance had not only falsified a marriage to manipulate company stock, but had married a corporate spy. The doors swung open before Caldwell could finish his sentence. Julian walked in, his presence commanding absolute silence, with Clara walking proudly right beside him. She did not look like a temporary secretary or a terrified pawn. She looked like a queen stepping into her own kingdom. Julian did not deny the accusations. Instead, he signaled Elias Grant, who handed a thick physical dossier to every board member at the table. Julian spoke, his voice echoing with lethal calm. He explained that Clara Thorne was exactly who Caldwell said she was, but her presence was not a scheme against Vance Global. It was an internal audit. Clara stepped forward, dropping the final set of decrypted financial records directly onto the glass table in front of Caldwell. She detailed exactly how Caldwell had used a ghost subsidiary to deliberately tank her father's engineering firm, siphoning the assets into his own offshore accounts and lying to the Vance board about the profit margins. Caldwell's smug smile vanished, replaced by a pale, trembling panic as the board members reviewed the undeniable proof. The room erupted in outrage. Investors who had backed Caldwell for decades immediately turned their backs on him, shouting for security. Caldwell tried to stutter an excuse, attempting to shift the blame, but the evidence was absolute. Within minutes, he was stripped of his titles, his shares frozen, and escorted out of the building by federal authorities who had been quietly waiting in the lobby. The man who had destroyed Clara's family was left with absolutely nothing, humiliated and ruined, in front of the very empire he tried to steal. That evening, the penthouse was quiet, but the freezing tension that had plagued them for days was gone. Julian found Clara standing on the balcony looking out at the city lights. He stepped beside her, slipping a warm coat over her shoulders. He did not offer empty apologies. Instead, he handed her a pristine legal document. It was the complete transfer of ownership of her father's original engineering firm, reinstated, fully funded, and separated entirely from Vance Global. Julian looked into her eyes, his usual arrogance completely stripped away, revealing a profound vulnerability. He told her that he had bought a wife to save his company, but he was willing to give up the entire company if it meant he could keep her for real. Clara looked at the document, the weight of her father's restored legacy bringing tears to her eyes. She looked up at Julian, seeing the genuine remorse and deep affection he had been hiding behind his corporate armor. She reached up, resting her hand softly against his cheek, and told him that she did not want his money or his company. She just wanted the man who remembered how she liked her coffee. Julian closed the space between them, pulling her into a kiss that held no contracts, no lies, and no hidden agendas. It was a promise, sealed with absolute truth. The months passed, bringing a new era for both of them. Clara successfully rebuilt her father's company, working side by side with Julian, their once rival empires now operating as a unified force. Their public appearances were no longer forced performances, but genuine displays of a partnership built on mutual respect and fierce love. They had started with a bitter contract, but they had rewritten every rule to build a legacy of their own. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time.
The deep analysis of the relationship between Julian Vance and Clara Thorne, captured so vividly in the structured infographic, begins with a recognition of the profound psychological profiles driving each character toward a shared destiny. Julian, a CEO whose public persona was one of unbreakable control, was a man isolated by emotional barriers. His ambition, the source of his corporate power, was paradoxically his deepest vulnerability, compelling him to use wealth as armor to keep humanity at a distance, as if every concrete block of the city belonged to him. In stark contrast, Clara is portrayed as a figure of resilient determination. Driven not by greed but by a profound ethical mission, she sought justice for her father's bankrupted legacy. Her apparent lowliness as a temporary secretary was merely a strategic disguise, hiding a courageous heart and empathetic spirit behind a quiet exterior, a seeking of truth fueled by an undying moral purpose rather than simple corporate ambition. Their relationship was initiated through a rigid deal of convenience, a contract meticulously designed to serve distinct, self-interested motivations. Julian needed to project a stable, married image by a fast-approaching shareholder summit to save his position from a board coup orchestrated using an old morality clause. Clara, realizing she had a unique opportunity to infiltrate his home network and find encrypted evidence to clear her father's name, accepted a financially rewarding contract in exchange for her unrestricted access. Their initial motivation was purely transactional, an exchange of public stability for silent intelligence, an agreement built on deception and strategic alignment rather than emotional commitment. The early stages of this marriage were marked by intense conflict, a continuous war of wills as the forces of psychological warfare played out. Julian provided high fashion meant to control Clara's image, yet she steadfastly resisted, wearing her own simple clothes to maintain an identity distinct from his influence. Their public dynamic was similarly tense, though Julian's protective instinct was momentarily sparked when an aggressive investor bothered Clara, leading to a lingering, cameras-only grip on her waist. Despite the constant clashing, forced proximity began to subtly erode their defenses. Small vulnerabilities crept into their armored existence. Julian's stubborn fever led Clara to care for him through a long night, and in return, he quietly ensured she received her specific preference of coffee the next morning. These silent, tender acknowledgments marked a crucial turning point, a transformation where care began to replace indifference. This fragile peace was eventually shattered by a powerful revelation when Clara was caught downloading encrypted files, exposing her true identity and connection to a firm destroyed by a Vance Global subsidiary years prior. This act of perceived betrayal initially ignited freezing rage, but it also revealed a critical truth that would change everything. The predatory practices that crushed her family were not masterminded by Julian but by Richard Caldwell himself. In the light of common corporate enemies, their conflict transformed into a strategic alliance. When Caldwell threatened to expose their fraudulent marriage, Julian and Clara, armed with decisive proof of Caldwell's corruption, presented a united front in the boardroom, utilizing collective intelligence rather than separate agendas to achieve absolute victory. The final phase of reconstruction and genuine love emerged from this shared experience, replacing transactional terms with real trust and equal partnership. Julian's act of redemption, transferring the restored ownership of her father's firm, proved his vulnerability and willingness to prioritize her legacy over corporate control, a profound step toward ethical value. Their eventual embrace on the balcony marked the definitive transition from a cold business transaction to a lasting promise, demonstrating how love could successfully rewrite psychological barriers to build a genuine, sustainable partnership based on mutual respect rather than control.